Sometimes, the most haunting stories don't end with death. They begin with it. What if I told you a single suicide note uncovered not just a life lost, but another body, hidden, silent, and waiting to be found? This is the story of Daniel Reeves, a 34-year-old man from suburban Ohio whose sudden death shocked his family and neighbors. On the morning of October 14th, his body was discovered in a small rented apartment, a half-empty bottle of whiskey by the bed, and a single sheet of paper lying neatly on the nightstand. But this wasn't just a farewell. This note would send police down a dark path, unraveling a crime no one saw coming. A crime that revealed not just despair, but guilt. Daniel Reeves was, to most people, invisible. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and rarely caused trouble. Neighbors described him as quiet, the kind of man you'd barely notice if he walked by. But beneath that silence, something was boiling. The note began, "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I can't carry the weight anymore. If you want answers, check the woods behind Miller's farm. You'll find her there. Tell her family I'm sorry." Police who read the note froze. Who was he talking about? And why point to the woods? Detectives rushed to the scene. Suicide cases rarely left them with leads to something bigger, but this was different. The handwriting was Daniel's. The ink was fresh, and the words weren't random, they were directions. Within hours, officers assembled a search team and headed toward Miller's farm, an abandoned property about 2 miles outside town. The land had been unused for years, overgrown with weeds, forgotten like the man who had just taken his life. The team moved slowly, combing through thick brush. At first, they found nothing, just the rustle of wind through dying leaves. But then, the dogs stopped. They had caught a scent, and just as Daniel's note suggested, they found her. A shallow grave, a woman's body. The quiet man who had taken his own life had carried a secret darker than anyone could imagine. Her name was Nancy Bennett, a 27-year-old who had been missing for almost 6 months. To her parents, she had vanished into thin air. Posters had lined the streets, her face spread across social media, but eventually the noise faded. Police had chased leads, but none had stuck. Until now, the discovery of her body reignited an investigation thought to be dead. And now, Daniel Reeves was the prime suspect, posthumously. Nancy's body was badly decomposed, but her clothing matched the description her family had given: a pale blue blouse, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Her phone and personal items were missing. Forensics would later confirm her identity, crushing what little hope her family had left. Her parents, Mark and Diane Bennett, were devastated. In a statement, Diane said, "We prayed every day she'd walk through that door. Now all we have are questions. Why her? Why did this man, someone we didn't even know, take her from us?" The town was in shock. A suicide had become a homicide. Police began digging into Daniel's life. At first glance, he seemed to have no connection to Nancy. They didn't work together. They weren't friends on social media. But phone records told a different story. Weeks before Nancy disappeared, Daniel had called her multiple times. And text messages revealed something even stranger. He had been trying to meet her. The question was, why? When investigators combed through Daniel Reeves' apartment, they weren't sure what they'd find. But what they discovered painted a disturbing picture of obsession. In his small one-room flat, detectives found dozens of notebooks filled with scribbled writings. Most were ramblings, fragments of thoughts, self-loathing, bitterness. But mixed within were pages about Nancy Bennett. Daniel had written about how he saw her at a coffee shop months earlier, how he thought she smiled at him, how he believed it was fate. "She's perfect. She notices me. She has too. I'll make her see." But to Nancy, he was just another stranger. Friends later testified she barely remembered him. Yet Daniel built a world in his mind where Nancy belonged to him. This wasn't love. This was obsession. Messages uncovered on Nancy's phone showed Daniel had contacted her repeatedly. She politely declined his invitations. But when she stopped responding altogether, his messages grew darker. "You can't ignore me forever. We're meant to be. You'll see." And then, silence. Days later, she disappeared. Nancy was last seen leaving her shift at a bookstore downtown. It was raining that night. A coworker remembered her saying she was heading straight home. She never arrived. Surveillance footage showed Nancy walking down the main street, umbrella in hand. Just behind her, partially visible in the grainy footage, was Daniel. Detectives believe Daniel followed her for several blocks. Witnesses later said they saw a man matching his description near Nance's apartment that night. She never made it inside. What happened in those missing hours would haunt investigators for months, until his suicide note cracked the case wide open. Investigators pieced together what happened on the rainy night Nancy vanished. They believe Daniel followed her for several blocks, waiting for the moment she was most vulnerable. Her apartment building was only 2 streets away, but she never made it inside. Neighbors later recalled hearing a muffled scream near the alley that connected the main street to the back lots. One witness told police they thought it was just kids messing around in the rain. That single detail would haunt them for months. Detectives suspect Daniel ambushed Nancy in that alley, forcing her into his car. Tire marks found days later seemed to confirm a vehicle had stopped there abruptly, but without knowing who to connect it to, police at the time dismissed it as coincidence. Back at Daniel's apartment, investigators found ropes, duct tape, and a blanket in the trunk of his car. They weren't fresh, but they were there. The chilling possibility was clear. Nancy had been taken against her will. Daniel Reeves looked like a lonely, troubled man on the surface, but deeper digging revealed something far more sinister. He was leading a double life. While he presented himself as a quiet recluse, he had spent hours online under fake names, joining forums about loneliness, rejection, and even darker spaces where violent fantasies were shared. Police discovered his laptop history was filled with searches about abductions and how to hide a body. To his landlord, he was a man who paid rent on time. To his co-workers at a local warehouse, he was just the guy who never talked much. But behind closed doors, he was planning, rehearsing, and building up to the night that would change Nance's life forever. The most disturbing evidence was in his journals. In one passage, dated just days before Nance's disappearance, Daniel wrote, "It's almost time. She'll see me. She'll have no choice but to stay." This wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. Nance's body, once recovered, gave investigators new leads. Though badly decomposed, the medical examiner confirmed she had injuries consistent with restraint. There were fibers on her clothing matching the rope found in Daniel's trunk. But one detail stood out: Nance's sneakers were clean. Too clean for someone buried in the woods. This suggested she hadn't walked into the forest herself. She had been carried. Detectives traced soil samples from her clothes and compared them to different locations. The type of clay matched Daniel's apartment building area, not the woods. This meant she had likely been held in his apartment before being moved to Miller's farm. The thought chilled everyone involved. Nancy may have been alive for hours, maybe days, before she was killed. Mark and Diane Bennett had spent months searching for their daughter. They organized search parties, handed out flyers, and begged for answers. Finding Nancy in the woods broke them in ways words could barely describe. Her mother, in a statement through tears, said, "I can't believe she was so close all this time, and we didn't know. We could have walked right past her. My baby was alone out there, while he lived his life like nothing happened." The community rallied around the family, but the grief was unbearable. Friends described Nancy as bright, warm, and always willing to help others. That such a life was cut short by a man she barely knew felt senseless. The family demanded answers. Why did Daniel target her? Why write that note only after taking his own life? What more was he hiding? Detectives returned to the suicide note, studying every word. The apology, the directions, the cryptic mention of her. But as they analyzed it more closely, they noticed something else, phrases that didn't fit. At the bottom of the note, in smaller, shakier handwriting, were the words, "I couldn't stop myself." She wasn't the only one. The implication sent a shockwave through the investigation. Was there another victim? Had Daniel taken more than one life? Detectives scoured missing persons reports, re-examined unsolved cases, and retraced his movements. For weeks, there were no leads. But then, they uncovered something that made the entire town shiver. Daniel had once lived near another young woman who had gone missing 2 years earlier. Her name was Melissa Carter, a 25-year-old who vanished in 2021. At the time, police ruled it a possible runaway case after finding no evidence of foul play. Her family never believed she left willingly. When investigators connected Daniel to Melissa's old neighborhood, their suspicions grew. He had lived only 3 streets away from her. Phone records revealed Melissa had received several calls from an unknown number in the weeks before she disappeared. That number was now traced back to Daniel's prepaid phone. Following this lead, police searched another wooded area near Daniel's former residence. Days of digging turned into weeks, but eventually, search teams uncovered human remains. Dental records confirmed it. Melissa Carter had been found. Daniel's suicide note had led to Nancy. But his last words also pointed to a second body. The man no one noticed had left behind not just one tragedy, but two. The discovery of Melissa Carter's remains cemented what investigators feared. Daniel Reeves had not only abducted Nancy, but he had taken another life years earlier. The quiet man in the shadows was, in fact, a predator who managed to escape detection until his own guilt consumed him. Melissa's disappearance in 2021 had been brushed aside by some investigators. She was an adult, they argued, and adults sometimes choose to leave. But her family never believed that. They said Melissa loved her life, her work, and her family too much to just vanish. Now, their suspicions had been proven right. Detectives began to reconstruct Daniel's life, and the similarities between Nancy and Melissa were eerie. Both were young, independent women. Both were friendly and kind to strangers. And both, at some point, had crossed paths with Daniel Reeves. Daniel's journals gave chilling insight into his mindset. He wrote about feeling invisible, rejected, and angry at the world. His writings painted a picture of a man who believed he was entitled to attention, and when he didn't get it, his bitterness turned violent. About Melissa, one entry read, "She walked past me every morning, never looked. One day, she'll have no choice but to notice." About Nancy, months later, he wrote, "She's the one. She smiled once. That's all I need. She won't forget me." The pattern was clear. Daniel convinced himself that casual encounters were meaningful, twisting them into stories where these women secretly belonged to him. When reality didn't match his fantasies, he forced his own ending. The news of two victims devastated the town. People who once shrugged off Daniel as a quiet neighbor now looked at his photo with horror. How had no one noticed the darkness living right among them? Local women recalled feeling uneasy when Daniel was nearby, how he stared too long, lingered too close. But none of them thought he was dangerous. He was just that strange man. The realization that those instincts had been right shook many. Parents began warning their daughters to never walk alone. The streets felt less safe, the community more fractured. For the families of Nancy and Melissa, grief was compounded by anger. Why hadn't Daniel been stopped sooner? Could Melissa's death have prevented Nancy's if police had dug deeper in 2021? Looking back, investigators found multiple moments where Daniel could have been caught earlier. When Melissa disappeared, his phone records showed frequent contact with her. That detail had been overlooked in the chaos of the investigation. When Nancy vanished, neighbors reported hearing a scream. Police noted it but didn't pursue it aggressively. Daniel slipped through the cracks each time, hidden by the assumption that he was just a troubled loner, not a killer. These missed warnings became a painful reminder of how dangerous it is to underestimate quiet obsessions. Experts who studied Daniel's writings described him as exhibiting traits of delusional obsession and narcissistic entitlement. He wasn't content with rejection. In his mind, rejection was impossible. He believed women owed him their time, their affection, even their lives. When they didn't respond, he rewrote reality in his head, until his fantasy demanded he act. One psychologist explained, to Daniel, attention was survival. When women ignored him, it felt like erasure. Taking them wasn't just about control, it was about forcing acknowledgement, no matter the cost. Understanding Daniel didn't excuse his crimes, but it revealed a terrifying truth. Some predators don't look like monsters. They look ordinary. They hide in plain sight. For Melissa Carter's family, the discovery of her remains brought both closure and devastation. After years of not knowing, they finally had answers, but those answers were unbearable. Her mother, Ellen Carter, said, "We kept her room the same, hoping she'd come back. Now, I have to accept she never will. He took her from us, and then he walked free for years like nothing happened." The Carters joined with the Bennetts, forming an unlikely bond forged through shared tragedy. Together, they began pressing for changes in how missing persons cases were handled. They wanted to make sure no other family had to wait years to learn the truth. Why did Daniel confess, even indirectly, in his suicide note? Investigators believe the weight of what he'd done finally crushed him. His journals in the weeks before his death were darker than ever. He wrote about nightmares where Nancy and Melissa stood at his bedside. He described waking up drenched in sweat, unable to silence the voices in his head. "They are always there. I see their eyes every time I close mine. I thought I'd feel powerful. Instead, I feel nothing but rot." For Daniel, death was his escape. But in leaving that note, he ensured his crimes would be discovered. Some believe it was his final attempt to control the story, confession mixed with cowardice. With Daniel dead and both victims identified, prosecutors closed the cases as solved. But there would be no trial, no courtroom justice. For the families, that absence was its own wound. Mark Bennett said, "I wanted to see him answer for what he did. Now he never will. He took the easy way out, and we're left with the pain." The police admitted failures in the early stages of both investigations. They promised reforms, but the promises did little to comfort those left behind. The truth was clear. Daniel Reeves had stolen 2 lives, and then silenced himself before facing accountability. Even after the cases were closed, the shadow of Daniel Reeves lingered. The woods where Nancy was found became a place of mourning, marked by flowers and photographs. The old neighborhood where Melissa vanished felt scarred, forever tied to the memory of a young woman who never came home. For the community, the case became a warning about listening to instincts, reporting red flags, and taking missing persons seriously. For the families, the legacy was more personal. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty chair at the table was a reminder of the lives stolen. Nancy Bennett and Melissa Carter weren't just victims. They were daughters, sisters, friends, women who deserved long, full lives. Their stories remind us that behind every headline is a family shattered. Behind every case is a silence that screams for justice. Daniel Reeves believed his note would end his story. Instead, it revealed the truth. His final words uncovered not just his own guilt, but the hidden horrors he left behind. This case is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones holding the darkest secrets. And sometimes, the truth only surfaces when it's far too late.